And now, let's welcome to the stage for Starting a Revolution, Emily Liddell, Editor-in-Chief of Rooted in Rights, disability rights activist, DeRay McKesson, civil rights activist, Beverly Gooden, activist and creator of hashtag Why I Stayed, and Susan Shearer, Editor-in-Chief, The Marshall Project.
Where would you like to be? You want to come here? Right.
I love rearranging furniture.
Go for it. Here.
We'll get it right. Thank you. Am I running your foot over? Oh, no. If I fall off?
I got you. We're good.
Amazing.
Well done. Okay. Terrific. All right then. Hello, everybody. It's very, very hard to follow Stacey Flowers. We think she's incredibly inspiring, but we have a really incredible lineup of powerful people right here. So I wanted to start off the conversation. As you know, each of these remarkable people has, in her or his own way, started a revolution. And I wanted first to ask everyone just to give us a little bit of a taste of why they decided to do what they did and how they got started. So let's start with Emily.
Hi, everyone. So I don't quite know how to condense my entire life into a quick answer, but that is the reality of the situation. I was born with my physical disability. It is a genetic disability, and so as you can all see, I use a wheelchair. My disability is very much a part of my life. It's part of who I am. And for so many people, they're really quick to reject that. They're really quick to say, no, disability is something that's negative. It's something that I don't want to identify as, or it's something that non-disabled people don't want to acknowledge. I decided to take that and turn it on its head and say, I am a proud disabled woman, and I believe, as corny as it may sound, that I was put here to do something about the fact that there is stigma against the disability community. It starts with one person, and so that's why I do what I do, because I was born this way, and I want everybody else to know that that's okay.
So Bev.
Yes, so I came into activism accidentally. I always say I'm the accidental activist. It was on Twitter too. So it was 2014, and TMZ released a video of Ray Rice. Have y'all seen that video where he punched his now wife in an elevator and then dragged her out of the elevator? So I was just kind of low key on Twitter then, and I had gotten divorced from my husband, who was physically abusive. For 2 years, he was physically abusive. And since that time, since I left, I just been kind of, quietly donating to domestic violence agencies and doing the marches and things like that, but not ever publicly speaking about my experience because I just wanted to put it behind me. So that happened. And so when the video came out, I remember that day, I was on Twitter, and all I saw were responses that said, why would she stay with him? Why wouldn't she just leave? If it were me, I would just run, things like that. And so in that moment, I felt the guilt and the shame, I think, associated not with being a victim, but being one who stayed, being one who made that specific choice. And so I just started to tweet some things about my experience, why I stayed, because my pastor told me that God hates divorce. I never thought that he might hate abuse too, why I stayed. I just kept saying my reasons for staying. And I think within the hour, it started to trend in the US. And since then, I've been speaking about domestic violence. And then I also, I always say there's two things you can do with attention. You can absorb it or you can distribute it. And so I chose to distribute it. So I started an organization where I send emergency escape bags to victims of domestic violence, regardless of age or gender identity, within 24 hours of the request of the website. And so I ship those bags out, and I've been doing it for about 5 years, just because I don't try to solve the problem anymore. Like domestic violence is a huge problem. I focus on removing roadblocks. And so I think, with domestic violence, lawmakers and advocates and activists have been working on the issue for so long. And so what can I do? I can work on a smaller scale. I can work locally. I can do individual work so that I can remove roadblocks from the lives of people who are suffering.
Thank you, Bev. And I think DeRay's story may be known to many of us, but perhaps you can tell a little bit about why you moved from being a teacher to throw yourself full-time into the movement and how you've been able to sustain it.
Yeah, so I spent most of my time around issues of policing and mass incarceration. You know, this is the first year ever where Black people are more afraid of being killed by a police officer than being killed by community violence, which is wild. But I started as a teacher. I taught 6th grade math in East New York, Brooklyn, and Starrett City. 6th grade is the best grade by far, any of you that I've ever taught. 7th grade is puberty and deodorant, and it is rough, but 6th grade is still really magical, and I love 6th grade. And I'll never forget, I taught 60, 90, and 120-minute classes, which is a lot of math for anybody, let alone an 11-year-old. And one day my students were like, can we go to gym? And I was like, you can absolutely go to gym because I'm tired of you, you're tired of me. It was like, we've been together for 100 minutes at that point. And then they came back really quick from gym, and I was like, why are you back so soon? And what I realized is that they were in love with the idea of gym more than the work of gym. And in this moment, I think there are a lot of people more in love with the idea of resistance than the work of resistance. Mm-hmm. So when I think about what called me to the work around police, it was like I was working in Minneapolis, I was leading staffing for the school system, and I talked about the importance of kids and young people, like I could give the speech and da-da-da, and then Mike Brown gets killed and he's a teenager, and it was like, the least I can do is stand in the middle of the street for a weekend. Like that is the very least I could do. And I stood in the street with many other people, and then the protests continued, and we had no clue. One of the sort of fascinating things about the protests when they began is that we were in the street for 400 days. People forget that it was 400 days. People also forget that it was illegal to stand still in August, September, and October of 2014. If we stood still for more than 5 seconds, we were arrested. But we actually had no clue that the world was watching. And it was sort of this beautiful tunnel vision that allowed us to stay in the street night after night. But I was called because a kid was killed.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, it's very interesting to hear even the different motivations. I think what fascinates a lot of us is, how do you turn that impulse into a strategy for finding an audience? How do you move from what you do on an individual level to how it influences others and brings others into a movement? And I think, Emily, we were talking in our preparation about getting outside the community that might first be most interested in your message. So can you tell us a little bit about the strategy for broadening the people who hear about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what I do is centered around storytelling. I believe that storytelling is how we connect and it's how we change the world. However, one thing that I have learned in my time as a professional disabled person, trademark, is that we are so insular within our communities. We all think that we're creating this incredible change, and it's true, we probably are, but we're creating it among the people who have already heard what we have to say. So how do we get beyond this bubble? But how do we get beyond the bubble in such a way that we're not feeling overwhelmed, like we have to change the entire problem, the entire system? What I tell people is that your strategy needs to be meeting people where they're at. And so the first thing that ends up happening is that a lot of activists are very rightfully angry about the things that they're fighting for. But the problem that I've encountered is that people come back at me and they say, you're really, really bitter. And I say, well, first of all, yes, I am extremely bitter because this is a world not designed for me and you're not making my life any easier. But let's break down this bitterness. I'm going to meet you where you're at. I ask that you meet me where I'm at. So my strategy tends to be, and I've turned this into a catchphrase over time, if we want the world to be accessible to the disability community, then it's up to us to make the experiences of disability more accessible and understandable to the world. So I think that can apply to any type of activism. Granted, it should not be on us all the time to do the teaching. It is sometimes difficult for me to be a living, breathing, rolling, teachable moment. And the emotional labor and the burden of that is something that shouldn't go unrecognized. But at the same time, I do realize that if we're not actively trying to engage with some of the people who are not understanding where we're coming from, we're not going to get outside that bubble. So my strategy begins with telling stories that get people to listen and then moving forward from there. And I know you're not going to get everyone to listen, but if you can change one person's mind at a time, we need to recognize how powerful that is.
Thank you, Emily. And Bev, you mentioned that you use social media as a powerful tool. It is an incredible tool in this day and age. But you also said that you're a part-time activist. You have to work to live.
Oh, yeah.
How do you balance getting your message out and feeling effective with also having to make a living?
Yeah, I think at first I struggled with two things really, like how much PTO can I take to go do activist work, but then also like, and this is kind of the tricky one, how do I reveal my true identity to my coworkers as a domestic violence activist? Because that's hard, believe it or not. It's hard to come out with that information to them because they only know me as Bev in human resources. I work in human resources. They just know that. They don't know Bev who was even married. You know, they don't know, especially that he was abusive. So letting them know that this is what I'm going to do is revealing more about myself than sometimes I've been willing to do. I've had several jobs since the hashtag came out. And so for me, it's just finding the balance. And that balance for me has been being really careful about who to trust, you know, with private information, with sensitive information. You know, anyone could Google, you know, the name and see the story, but most of your coworkers don't just go around, I don't know what y'all do, but, you know, they'll just go around Googling people. So I don't need,
Right.
on lunch break, Google you. But you know, like that doesn't usually happen. And so unless I tell them, they won't know. And so I'm really careful about who I tell. And I live in Texas, and Texas is Texas. Hey, Texas, Houston, H-Town, what's that? We got to connect because I like your shoes. So, Houston. So, but I live in Texas, and Texas is very Texas. And so, you know, Texas for women is different, you know? Well, not too different, you know, but it is what it is. And so knowing that, how do I then reveal that I fight for women or women's equality or that I'm a feminist? Like, how do you have those conversations and still maintain, you know, professional conversation in the workplace? And I struggle with it. I still do, but hopefully it's become easier over time, but my strategy for that is to just know who to trust and when to trust them. You know, my boss, I usually tell immediately that I'm an activist, I'm gonna go do these things, I'm gonna go speak, this is what it is. But everyone else is just kind of like slide it in when necessary. But the PTO problem I haven't conquered because I use so much PTO.
Yeah.
I use so much PTO. It's like vacation, what? It's going out to do the things. But with that as well, I think I have to be careful. We have to be careful not using so much PTO to do activist work that we become drained and we don't take that beach vacation. You know, because even with engaging on social media, I don't always do that. I give myself permission to disengage without guilt. Because sometimes things will happen in the news and it's domestic violence related, and I don't even log on Twitter. Like, I'll just stay off Twitter because I have to ask myself, will this re-traumatize me, and can I handle that right now? And the answer is not always yet. So I even say that to you. Give yourself permission to disengage without guilt. And then when you're ready to, re-engage, because the work does need you, but I believe it needs the healthy you, you know?
Now, Dre, obviously at the beginning, Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, there was an enormous amount of publicity and recognition. And you've done something really interesting with Pod Save the People. You've found a way to kind of sustain the conversations, but I wondered about a couple of things. One is your own burnout. You know, how do you keep going and refuel? And the other is, how do you keep people paying attention? I know there are plenty. I mean, one thing that tragically helps, and I know this in my new position at the Marshall Project where we write about mass incarceration and policing, is that there are so many triggers in the news that renews people's attention on this crisis. But how do you move it beyond people saying it's a tragedy to, I, DeRay, can help you see what to do?
Yeah, I think so. I am tired.
Yeah.
I'm tired. I was on a 1 a.m. flight from LA here. So tired. So the reason that I stay in the work, though, is I really do think we can win. Like, I believe we can win. I don't think that's like a dramatic thing. I think we can do it. If the Republicans can rewrite the tax code in 5 days on scrap paper, then like we can do all of this. Like I like believe that. So I think we can win. This question of like how do we keep attention is real. I'm a little quieter than I was in 2014. Not because I'm less passionate, but because I think people don't realize that the police have killed more people since 2014, not less. And people think that because the conversation has changed, that the outcomes must have changed, and they haven't, right? The outcomes are actually worse than before the protest. So I've been spending most of my time trying to figure out, like, what do we do to actually change? Like, it's not a win to be on a million panels and write a book, and like, that's not a win if like the outcomes don't change, right? And I'm painfully aware that we've done all of us have done a really great job of changing the conversation, changing the language, like the outcomes are worse and not better. So that is like keeps me sane and focused, and I really do, I think we can win. Now, the things about storytelling that I'm mindful of, one is this idea that part of our work is to create entrances and on-ramps, and I think when we do justice work sometimes, it's a reminder not to be so arrogant to believe that the only way to enter is the way we enter. I think there are a lot of us who I think in 2014, I would have been like, if you talk about the police and it's not about race or sort of this frame of justice, then you don't get it. And now I realize there are a lot of people who it's about fairness. It's really not about race. It's really not about whatever they think justice is. They're like, this just isn't fair. And I'm like, cool. If fairness is what gets you in the door, then I can work with that. But if I never get you in the door, I actually can't do anything with you. And I have a better understanding of that. So when I was talking to my aunt is always my bar. If I can explain it to my aunt, I can explain it to anybody. Not because my aunt is stupid, she is not. She's just busy. She got a lot going on. So when I was talking to Aunt Mink about Kavanaugh, I was saying, you know what? They hiding the papers. She's like, the papers? I'm like, it's some papers from the White House. They hiding the papers, Aunt Mink. She's like, they hiding the papers? I'm like, girl, it's bad. They hiding the papers. And she was like, that's so bad. I'm like, and he don't believe in a woman's right to choose. She was like, he don't. I'm like, girl, see? It's bad. But it was once I got her in, I could do a lot of things. So I'm mindful of that. Yeah. The second is people are like, the data's important. But it also, the power of storytelling is real. So when I talk to people now, we say if you close your eyes and imagine the place where you feel the most safe, the police probably aren't there. And whatever you imagine is something that we can make for everybody. We want to put whatever's in the room where you felt the most safe, we want to make that everybody's room. Yeah. The police weren't in that room. And helping people reframe the way they think about what safety is has actually been really powerful, more powerful than talking about the numbers. And the third thing is really this idea of what is true and what's not true. So I'll ask you, of all the arrests that happen in the country, what % do you think happen for violent crime? We're going to raise your hand in a second. But of all the arrests that happen in the country, what % do you think of the arrests happen for violent crime? If you think that more than 50% of the arrests happen for violent crime, raise your hand. 40 to 50%? 30 to 40%? You have to raise your hand at some point. 20 to 30%? Okay, 10 to 20%? Less than 10%? It's 5%.
Oh, it's 5%.
It's really low. So when you think about 5% of the arrests, less than 5% are convictions, right? Because not everybody who's arrested gets convicted. But people think that it's so much more. And if you think it's so much more, you're more likely to believe that locking people in cages makes sense, or that police killing people is probably a good public safety thing. So much of it too is what is fact and what is fiction.
Yeah. I think one of the things that really brought out, DeRay, is a question about what are the most effective strategies for getting people involved and breaking through myths, right? And I wondered if each of you could talk about that point that DeRay began putting in conversation, but also if there was a strategy that you abandoned because it was ineffective. What did you learn not to do as well as to do?
So first of all, I want you all to take a look around you right now. Do you see a lot of visible representation of disability? And if you're gonna point to the woman in the wheelchair in the corner over there, that's my mom, so it doesn't count.
Exactly.
Hi, Mom. So now, statistically speaking, there are plenty of people in this room who do have invisible or hidden disabilities, absolutely, and we cannot underestimate that. However, my biggest strategy is asking yourself who's not at the table and if that table is accessible. because sometimes people say, well, make yourself a seat at the table. I can't really make myself a seat at the table if it's up 3 flights of stairs and you've got a bunch of chairs around it, because in case you didn't notice, I come with my own. So my biggest strategy is not necessarily asking people to dive in head first, but asking them to do an assessment of the people that they surround themselves with, of the people who are talking about the issues, and recognizing whether you're listening to people who are calling themselves allies, which allyship is incredibly important, or if you're actually listening to the people who are directly impacted by the topic at hand. So there's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. But people seem to ignore this quite a bit, largely because they seem to make judgments about our abilities to communicate our needs and to advocate and be activists on our own behalf. So my biggest strategy is to think about the people you're surrounding yourselves with, the people you're allying with, the people who you need to pass the mic to when the time comes to bring them into the door. You know, I think what happens a lot is that disability is kind of seen as this scary thing pushed off to the side. I say we're in the margins of marginalization still because nobody wants to talk about it, even though disability is actually the largest minority in the world. And it's also, and this is not a threat, I promise, the only minority that anyone in this room can join at any time. I don't bite though, I'm like a lot of fun, so it's fine. So I just ask that people really be aware about the perspectives that are being involved in the conversation. Think about who's represented.
Great, thank you. Bev.
So one thing I stopped doing is arguing with men. I just
Okay.
don't recommend it, but no, but seriously. So yeah. So I used to have a lot of online trolls that were men's rights activists, things like that. And I used to attempt to go toe to toe with them, like, but they're not interested in anything that you have to say or that I have to say. They know the domestic violence. They know it's bad. They don't care. And so it took me like 2 years, but I realized that that's not effective, and it's also not healthy for me to do that. So I stopped doing that. But one thing that I do find effective is not, shouting out things about domestic violence, or because people know domestic violence exists. It's not necessarily showing pictures of bruised women or, people who've experienced domestic violence, because I don't like that. I don't like that in the news. I don't like to see that either. And people that have experienced don't like to. For me, what I found effective in this specific field is pointing out inconsistencies. And there's so many of them. For instance, I'll have a lot of people that I'll talk to about domestic violence, and they'll say, well, I don't know anybody that's experienced domestic violence, or not a lot of people experience domestic violence, or it's not like, sexual assault. It's not a lot of people. And I'm like, 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence. 1 in 6 men experience domestic violence. It is statistically impossible for you not to know someone who's experienced domestic violence. All of us in this room. So that's what I do. Like, I'll hear that inconsistency, I'll point it out, and then people start to think, well, is it statistically it's not. I just told you. Like, it's statistically impossible, And so that is something that I found to be effective, because I think a lot of times we rely on the shocking picture, the shocking news story, the shocking photo, and I think sometimes people are shocked out. They're just all shocked out. It's just kind of like, and then it becomes something that you see all the time, and then you desensitize to it. But I think like just pointing out inconsistencies has worked for me, has been effective.
Yeah. Dre, anything you wanted to add on that score?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I understand better today than I did in 2014 is this notion that one is enough. That like, it's only with poor people and people of color that one is never enough, that like 1 million people gotta die, there have to be 1 million stories for us to do something. But in affluent communities, like one thing happens and we have rewritten the whole like law, we've redone everything. So one is enough to like ask questions, and we have to be more thoughtful about that. The second is, this is actually the first time I'm processing in real time, like something that I am thinking about differently is that one of the hard things about the protests is that we got called to the street because people got killed. So there are a lot of us, and you just know my name, but there are a lot of us who have some sort of survivor's guilt. Like we totally get that like the reason why we talk about this is because other people aren't alive to talk about it, right? We get it. And there is this sort of weird, it's like we have all had to learn how to stop apologizing for surviving, but also know that like the reason we do this work is so we should never have to talk about surviving again because people should just be alive, right? And like that is sort of this interesting thing. I do think that, and this is sort of not what I have stopped doing, but I do think I wish we had fought a little bit more in the beginning. That one of the things about the protest that's sort of hard is that there are a lot of things that are untrue that people just believe, and in the social justice space, there's a lot of fighting that happens, but like you'll never see, like you'll never, people keep it really hidden and da-da-da, and I think it actually does a disservice to the public conversation because people don't know the fault lines or you don't understand like the disagreements that are like rooted in philosophy. It's not like personal things. It's sort of like what is reform, what isn't reform. And like you've never seen those conversations happen because like we're doing it in back rooms because there's this idea that like if you saw the disagreement, you would not believe in the work anymore. And I actually think that that like isn't fair to the people who support the work. And like I don't know how to do that 5 years in, but I do wish that we had just had more public battles about ideas early because we had the fights, we just had them really quietly. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the things I worry about with the big platform is that people think it started like this. I had 800 followers on Twitter when the protest started. I made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches the first week, and I made great peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Like anything that's ever changed the world has started in somebody's living room or somebody's porch. Like that is how all the things that have ever changed the world, they didn't start with 1 million followers on anything, And I think people forget that like the changing the world stuff is always living room stuff.
Thanks so much. I think we're opening up to some questions now. Oh, okay. We have another. So I guess what I would say is I think one of the things that I would just like to do quick fire before we turn to questions is if anyone in this room wants to figure out how to turn a private passion or concern into action, what's a resource you'd recommend for them or something that you'd suggest that they think about? And I'm not saying start a whole movement. I mean, how do you participate?
Find your community. I know that that's exactly what we're doing in this room today, but don't underestimate the other places that you can find your community. It doesn't always have to be in the walls of a conference room. It doesn't always have to be in the traditional networking situations. For me, I would say that when I was really turned on to disability activism was when I started to realize that I wasn't existing in that bubble anymore, that so many other people were also doing the work, and I discovered that on Twitter. So yes, I'm telling everybody to go onto Twitter and find their communities, but it's more than that. Think about the people who are already in your life who may also be grappling with a particular issue that's of importance to you as well, and start from there. Your community doesn't have to be this gigantic group of people, but nor do you need to feel alone. There are plenty of places to turn to find it. And once you have that community behind you, that's when you can really get started pushing forward.
Bev, a quick thought on that.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite quotes I know you've heard of is by Bayard Rustin, and he said, "Speak truth to power." And I think that's important, but I go even further and I would say become the power. Start the business, run for office, network in your field, whatever it is, become as powerful as you can, and then lift others up with you so that the power doesn't ultimately rest with you, it rests with the people.
Thank you.
2 quick things. One is follow the question all the way to the end. I can't tell you the number of people who come up to me and they're like, I want to do something around mass incarceration. I'm like, what do you care about? They're like, mass incarceration. I'm like, well, what part of mass incarceration? They're like, and you're like, what is good? Like, you actually don't know anything. And like there's enough out there that you should find like what part of the work you actually really care about, because there are enough problems that like we can actually direct you to what you care about. We don't have to like make you do something else. So that's that. The second thing is be willing to take the truth with you everywhere. One of the reasons why I'm not always critical about President Obama is that we had 2 meetings with him. One was the longest meeting he had in the White House. It was 4 hours, the longest meeting during his presidency. And what was really wild and disappointing is that there were all these civil rights people in the room, and people did not bring the truth with them. We went one by one. People were like, thank you, President Obama. You're like, what you thanking him for? He did nothing around the police. Like literally, he did nothing around the police at that point. He hadn't done enough, but it was all these people who like their public persona was like, we fight the power, da-da. And in the room, people I like respected literally said to President Obama, we need a revolution of love. And I'm like, this is the wildest thing I've ever seen. But it was a reminder for me that people get to a certain place in their career and comfort becomes more important than truth. And like, how do we make sure that we actually take the truth with us into all of the rooms is much harder in practice, I saw that day, than I would have believed.
That's super interesting. I think I was thinking a lot about it, the question of what you all said about kind of how to think, because I'm a journalist. I don't do action. I think about how to bring problems to light and shine light on them, and others take action. But I also think that the whole idea of get powerful and help others, I think that's real. I think that's something everyone in this room can relate to, because even in business, in my previous life before the Marshall Project, I was at the New York Times and I became a fairly senior executive, and I was always trying to find women and people of color who I could, kind of give a helping hand to as I got higher up the ranks. And so I do think that there's a way to apply this in any part of your life, and your reactions to that made me reflect on that. Now how much more time, because we started a little bit later. Okay, so we're just wrapping it up. So I guess I would just ask if there's any ending message you want to leave our audience with as we finish this really cool discussion.
That's a tough one, but as quickly as possible, all of the little tidbits that you've taken away today, make sure you kind of turn things around on yourself and take that time to do a little bit of self-reflection. I would be completely remiss if I left this stage without acknowledging the fact that while I lack privilege in particular areas because of my disability, I am still a white woman who is in the midst of this conversation. And so I have had to learn to turn things back on myself because I'm out there and I'm loud and I'm an activist. And some people have had to tell me, take a step back because you're taking up space that belongs to other people. And that's not really something that you ever want to hear. It's not a fun thing to hear, but it's true. Sometimes you have to sit down and shut up.
Very interesting.
I really like that you said that, because I consider myself someone who is part of a group, that is not the dominant group, but I also know that trans women experience violence unlike anything that I've ever experienced or will ever know. And so it's important to acknowledge your own privilege. Like, I am not a trans woman, but I can learn how to support trans women. But aside from that, I would say, I don't really have any closing words except to remind you that domestic violence is a community issue, and it requires a community response. And so if you are here today, you are amongst people who have experienced domestic violence, always, everywhere you go, every room that you're in. And so just remembering, that domestic violence is all of our issue. It's not a family issue. It's not a private issue. It's not an individual issue. It's not a couple's issue. It's our issue. And in order to end it, or at least prevent it, we're going to have to work together to do that.
Thank you.
A couple thoughts quickly. One is that we always say that white supremacy is a smog, and we all inhale the smog whether we want to or not. That part of our work is to make sure that we see it when we inhale it and that we don't exhale it, right? That we actually don't put it back out into the environment. So remembering that we all participate in parts of it no matter what, because we inhale it. The second is that one of the things I understand better today than I did in 2014 is this idea that we have to fight for what we think we deserve, not what we think we can win. And too often we fight for what we think we can win, which is never really what we think we deserve. And the battle has to be the people that we are up against. They are always fighting for what they think they can deserve. They're like, abortion clinics in the mall. They're not just in one. They're like, no more any of that. They are always fighting for this wild vision. And we're like, hope there's one more thing. And it's we should actually fight for the biggest vision possible. And the third thing is that when I said before, take the truth with you, sometimes people think, because I'm a protester, people think that means yell in every room or shout in every room. I'm reminded that we can take the truth in a host of ways. So I've been in jobs where I had no structural power. And part of the way to tell the truth was to ask the question, is this the best that we could do? Do you think that this makes sense? And you're it's those sort of things actually do way more work than you think. And it doesn't always have to be yelling and shouting is how we bring the truth, but be the person to say, I don't think we've talked about this. I think we should reconsider this idea. Is everybody in the room? Those things actually matter infinitely more than people believe in the moment.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder that we have a wonderful bookshop down